So another talk, another group. Mark and Lxxxiv are here this morning, and it is Sunday, July something or another, July 7th. So we talk about this to anyone listening so that we can introduce ideas that I suspect everyone knows in a knowingness that isn't always thought to be known. And by bringing it to conversation and looking at some of these principled ideas about life and about our existence, my experience has been that a lot of the stress and anxiety has been relieved from things that weren't happening, but it also comes with the clear awareness of things that are happening are also stressful and often depressing. So to see something that's actually happening that's disturbing would naturally be disturbing. But to think of things that aren't happening as disturbing is to create an experience that's a preoccupation that keeps us from actually noticing what's happening and seems to disconnect us when in fact we're connected while we're thinking we're not connected. We're part of it all while thinking all that's happening is what we're thinking. And that obsessive cycle of thinking can seem like reality. And we tend to talk about having our own reality. And if reality exists, it can't be each of ours, it must be all of ours. And to think in those terms is very similar to the thinking that changed when people realized that the horizon, while it looked like the edge, wasn't the edge. It was really the beginning of everything rather than the end of anything. So what we're talking about is looking at thinking and limited thoughts and the horizon of those thoughts as being the beginning of everything rather than the end of anything. Starting to notice that the limited thoughts we have to fight for them is to continue to keep this sensory deprivation of isolation in our experience, because the thinking we're doing is isolated from reality, and the way that we're thinking about reality when it's wrong and thought to be right, it creates a very, very interminable interconflicted condition that involves emotional turmoil and mental anguish. Naturally, anxiety, stress, etc., are charges building up in our systems that tend to, I know when I get angry, I tend to find that the anger seems to be a little outsized for the situation because it's built and built and built and built. And when I finally let it go, it's like relieving pressure in a balloon that's really filled with a lot of air. The pop is a lot louder. The expression of it's a lot louder. So I'm saying that because I don't talk about these things to suggest that I don't have those same problems anymore. I want to talk about them so I can talking about the problems allows me to get a little better at noticing what I'm doing while I'm doing it, so I can acknowledge it and discuss it at the point it's happening, rather than 6 months later when I realize I may have been a little bit outsized or a little bit overreactive or something. A little more immediate, spontaneous, because everything that's happening is always happening in the present. It's not happening at some other time or place. So Mark and I have been spending some time. Mark's been doing a little homework lately. Lxxxiv and I haven't seen each other for a while, so it's good to see you and have you here. A bunch of our normal people are off on a 4th of July holiday, taking advantage of freedom that we all have every day to do whatever we want. And I would suggest whatever we do is exactly what we want. Even when we think we don't, it shows how quickly we can try to disavow ourselves of having caused it by making believe we don't like the effect and that we have nothing to do with it. So that's a major glitch in the thinking process. We can do it. It doesn't lead to any functional capacity. It leads to a dysfunctional incapacity, a diminished capacity, I would say.
So I like what you were saying a little bit ago, Jack, right before you started the recording about, saying that you don't think you're talking about things that people don't already know, just putting it into words that people don't necessarily, I guess, I don't know exactly what you said, but maybe associate or look at it through those words.
Well, and I suspect, Mark, to that point, the point Mark was making, that I said I'm doing my best to engage with a group in this discussion that's interested in the discussion, not just coming as a token of friendship because they know me or think I want them to, but actually have a personal interest in this. And like sobriety, you can't get sober if you don't notice you have a problem. Nobody can make that decision for a person. I can make it and they can think my making of it is enough, but it won't be enough at some point when they start thinking again for that seeming self they think for, and think the best thing they can do is go out and use. So the diagnosis here is the participation. If you're here and you're interested and you're engaged, it's a very different discussion than if you're coming thinking I have something to say that you don't already know. And my sense is every person struggling with an addiction knows they have a problem, but they're treating it as though it's a solution, desperately trying to overcome that greater awareness they have by continuing to do the thing more and more and more and more because they get more and more tolerant of it. But to your broader point, Mark, if we didn't know this, I can't put it into any words that would make sense to anyone if we didn't already know it, because the abstract nature of this actually completely eliminates any rational, reasonable, logical conclusion. Because thinking is based on a limited concept of analytically processing information. Thinking isn't creating reality, it's basically processing what is perceived reality, turns it into perception. So if we have a basis, an elementary essential basis between us of knowing awareness, which would be an omniscient, omnipotent source, then there is no option there. That isn't a choice. It's just a state of being that we all share. To speak to that, I can speak to it in any words I want. You can think of it in any words you want. If you're thinking of that spirit, you're going to have those words confirmed as reckoning with it, because the expansiveness of your experience will confirm it. The affirmation of those words in any form will confirm the knowing of it as you begin to apply it. Just like the concept of having a God of our own understanding gives us a chance to begin to realize in sobriety that there's something bigger than the self, came to believe in a power greater than ourself, right? So this is the end of the limits of our thinking is the definition of ourself. We're coming to a belief. We're simply realizing there's something more than what we've been believing in as the sole source of our existence. And if that source is infinite, then we've always had it. We just like we always had a problem when we drank. Didn't seem like it when we weren't drinking quite as much as we eventually did, or drugging quite as much as we eventually did. But once I came to terms with that, I realized I knew all along something was wrong. I wouldn't have thought the first drink was a relief if I wasn't depressed when I took that first drink. If I was elated and whole and satisfied and joyful when I took the first drink, I would have said, wow, that doesn't taste good, makes me feel odd. That wasn't my experience. I thought I found a solution. I thought I found that gateway, that bridge, that escape. Obviously, my sick thinking was being treated by sick actions. So if we know it and talk about it, we can use any words and still confirm the deeper understanding of that awareness.
You know, I still think what I was getting at was I truly understand what you were saying in the beginning, but I think I've also learned things that I didn't know since I met you, or since I've been attending, or whatever you want to call it.
Do you think that those things you think you didn't know were just thinking you didn't know, but you knew all along? I mean, is that possible?
Yes, it's possible.
Yeah.
Um,
So it depends what you're learning. If you're learning functional ways of trying to feel better and do things that make you feel better,
or process, learning ways to process. And you know, again, I go back to one of the greatest things that I've learned to understand since attending is that reality is absolute, and definitely, absolute of my thoughts.
Absolute.
Of my thoughts, especially absolute of my thoughts. Reality is absolute of my thoughts.
Your thoughts themselves are a product of reality. It's how you think and what you think. When you think what you think and how you think is true, that you make believe is real, that becomes a problem. Because it isn't actually real, it's just a conclusion you've made. It's a decision you've made. If I conclude that I'm the maker of reality, I all of a sudden am at the same time opposing reality by that conclusion. It's an impossible way to live.
But yet I do it all the time.
Well, I don't know that you do it all the time. but I would say the times you do it are so obvious that it seems like that.
Yeah.
So my sense is this knowingness isn't a process of thinking at all. It's just an absolute. We wouldn't notice the disruption if we didn't have an absolutely calm state of being as a reference point. And it's not the same kind of reference point that we think of in terms of space, where you have a position here and a position there, and people take their positions and there's distance between them. It's a reference point of absolute knowing. It's a reference point of that thing people seem to find when they go into meditation and close their eyes and they're a quiet environment. And they find this profound sense of awareness that doesn't seem to be there when they're busy thinking. It's there when they're busy thinking. And our discussion is talking about beginning to realize this in discussion with our eyes open. So it's an awake and contemplative meditation rather than one induced by isolation and quiet and gives us the impression that we already have. To do it that way, in my experience, I want to take credit for having done it and say, yeah, I've solved the problem. When in fact, if the problem is a gift, if the solution is a gift, if the absolute nature of life is a gift, I would be saying thank you rather than I need to do something about it to make it better. I wouldn't be taking credit for it. I'd just be saying thanks, grateful. So the natural state of gratefulness is beginning to become aware that that thing you described, Mark, is in fact our nature. It isn't an optional, transitional, negotiable, variable reality. It's an ever-present, absolute state of being. And that, beautifully, is the same for everyone. And everything, every grain of sand, every bit of space between the grains of sand that seem like no space at all. So in what you said, you didn't think you knew it. At least you're becoming aware of the fact that you know more than you think.
Yes.
That sort of transitioning you in that direction of saying, wow, I know a lot of things I don't think I know. So I would say addiction, Mark, is in fact this sense that, you know, how the book talks about strange mental blank spots.
Uh-huh.
When I decide to oppose reality, I think reality, I've turned from reality because I'm still thinking of it from a physical human experience. So I think I can turn my back on it. Probably impossible to do that because it isn't a spatially bound. I can't turn my back on something that isn't in space and time. So when I do that, I make
Knowing
believe.
something? Sorry, go on.
Well, if I'm thinking I create reality, I'm using this as an example, then I'm really also thinking of this because in the relative world that we seem to live in, this physical world, any position I take has an opposite position. So I think something's good, it's based on things I think are bad. It's the culmination of a decision that I've made within this relative situation. So if I think I'm the creator of reality, I think it's literally possible to oppose reality and I'm going to win that fight. Because now I'm busy. This is what obsessive thinking is. I get so busy trying to continue to maintain the thinking that I think there's nothing else going on. Now,
I think the reason why I can do that is because I'm willing to continue lying to myself.
bingo. Yeah. So that's a willingness that if you start noticing, we have great willingness when it comes to lying and cheating and ego and false ideas and all that stuff. We have great willingness. People think they suffer from willingness. No. We're looking at it as isolate. We're looking at it still in human terms to think we suffer from willingness when it comes to an infinite spirit that doesn't need any willingness at all on our part to be exactly what it is and never change. It doesn't come or go. It doesn't get bigger or smaller. It doesn't give any more or less, ever. There's no variability in it. So it's not to say we don't need faith, but if I have faith for a moment, it's confirmed by the awareness. If I'm sincere and genuine and honest in my faith, and starting to actually, rather than create a new concocted version of a lie and say, well, I tried God and God doesn't work. Well, that sounds to me like you didn't try God. You tried an idea about God that certainly doesn't work. And there again, I'm committed to this idea that thinking is my source, my only rational option. And as a result, I think more about my thinking and try to confirm it by fighting and defending against any opposing thought. So if that knowing is knowing, then we all know it. And to start speaking in those terms is also starting, Mark, you're in my experience with you, because we've been talking the last couple of weeks about, I think, some points you got to that you both felt stuck and also passed. You start to see you're actually observing what's going on. You've always been an observer of what's happening. But when I think what's happening is only what I think is happening, I start to think I'm no longer the observer. I start to think I'm in the thinking. I've created a narrative and an image that now I'm stuck in the thinking. And people say, I feel stuck in my head. My thoughts attack me. They're intrusive. They keep going on and on and on. All those things are attributes of this idea that now I'm in the bubble of thought. I'm not watching the bubble bath of all my thoughts. And what's interesting when I see it from the outside, if you look at the outside of a bubble, it's a mirror. And a concave mirror shows everything from every perspective, except the opposite. You know, if you're holding a ball in your hand, you can never see the opposite side of it. So it's the same in our human experience. We see the horizon because beyond that is the other half of the earth, depending on where we're standing. Actually, it's not quite the other half because the horizon isn't at the extreme opposite end of where I'm standing. It's much closer than that. But the fact is that the rest of the sphere is beyond the horizon. So from an outside, the bubble actually reflects. The reflection on the bubble is the observer. You see everything else. If you're in the bubble and look at a bubble and see a concave mirror, it's like the circus mirrors that are you become super tiny. And everywhere you look, you see this tiny image of you looking. So what is that? Feeling less than, low self-worth, low self-esteem, disconnected. I'm this tiny little thing in the universe. We're not tiny when we're connected to everything. We're actually a part of the whole thing. We can't be divided in our essence. So the thinking we can do about division creates the sense of separation. It isn't true, it isn't real, but that's the mania of manic obsessive, bipolar, this idea that polarization is possible and I can be one thing and not the other thing. And all of a sudden say I'm taking this position against all other positions, rather than see any position I take confirms all other positions that can be taken. So I know if I take a position, everyone can take any other position they want. It doesn't threaten me when they do because I'm prepared for that. I understand it properly. When I think my position's the only position, any position anybody takes seems to be an affront, offensive. So let me suggest, Mark, lenses. Our awareness, we generally think we know things that serve the thinking we think we know. So if it's outside of that realm, we think we don't know it. How convenient. What is that called? Self-serving thinking. It's serving the self that's thought to be at the center of that. And when that self, all that self is thinking of itself. So I wrap a new layer of thinking around it and think there's a self centered in the middle, when all that's thinking is more and more thinking about the thinking, which is obsessive thinking. So if that thing I call myself is something I'm talking to all the time and negotiating with and thinking about, I'm not thinking about myself, I'm simply thinking about my thinking, I'm contemplating. But to mistake it and make believe it's who I am is identity theft. It's like fraud, which is why people hate being called liars, because they're lying. Lies are filled with hate. They're made of hate and defensiveness and reactiveness and fear, because they're so weak and vulnerable as to not even exist beyond the opinion of the thinker of them, continuing to maintain them as though they are in fact real and true, when they're effectively hallucinations, trances, imagery, illusion, considered to be reality. I know I was heading in a direction that went a little different than that, but part of it is starting to see that the thinking we're doing about the thinking we're doing isn't actually knowledge, it's just understanding. And when I'm thinking about things that are misunderstood, I think misunderstanding becomes just like I think I become in the bubble when I think I'm in my thoughts. That's all imagined. And the effects, by the way, are the same as a dream. If you were stuck in a bubble in the middle of space, your dream might be a nightmare because you're feeling so alone and so separate and so apart and so completely isolated. We create those dreams in the day, and they're often nightmares, which is what that self-centered fear seems to be. But if I'm doing that and imagining that that is, in fact, the totality of my existence, I have nothing to learn from anything or anyone but how to continue to maintain the insanity of that. I've really turned misunderstanding into understanding and sanity into insanity. These are induced forms, by the way. I'm not giving a medical diagnosis, but they're induced forms of insanity, meaning I'm beginning to think of reality as an illusion, fantasy, as reality. Complete conjecture. So to begin noticing that is to begin to see that the knowing awareness we have is the anxiety, the stress, the doubt, the uncertainty. All of those effects that we think we're trying to get over are the information of our awareness telling us, if you read the script and you're open to listening, your functional literacy literally is beginning to dysfunction based on the stress, the pressure, the conflict, and all of these things that I'm witnessing, the emotional turmoil, the sense of isolation. All of those things are telling me about my thinking, not about my source, what we call myself.
Exactly.
We've been mistaking our self for our thinking, rather than seeing that our self is in fact the same self we all share with an absolute knowing awareness that's pure consciousness and has been given to us somehow. Perhaps we're more than the bodies we have in that greater sense. And I would say we certainly are, but I don't know that we're the creators of that consciousness. What I know is we share it equally, because if that thing has what it has, it gives us what it has. And what it has is an infinite basis of knowledge. And that knowledge isn't the thinking knowledge. It's not an analytical, it's not a circumstantial knowledge. It's not a consequential, just an awareness of pure peace, love, support,
Yes.
wholeness. So if I'm functioning on that basis in terms of my understanding, now I'm actually understanding things. And if you think of the word understanding, it suggests there's something under my standing, same as substance, below my feet. They don't even understand gravity, but we all know it works. We don't have to think about it or
Yes.
understand it to know when we get up in the morning, our feet are going to hit the ground if we choose to move them in that direction. And if we trip and fall, we're not going up. We're going down. So we have this knowing that we rely on visibly that's invisible, and yet struggle with the invisibility of an indivisible nature. We just haven't talked about it. My suspicion is Bill Wilson opened the door, and it was on the heels of multiple other organizations and thought thinkers, both in religion and outside of religion, that culminated in his compilation of their thinking. Because at any point in history, we are all witnessing the sum total of everything that's ever happened. So all the information we need is here right now, and there's nothing missing from it. It's actually complete and whole. If we're not able to listen to our own conflicts, certainly we're not going to hear that greater intuitive knowingness or interpret it in any kind of meaningful way. So we either act in reactivity and desperation and continue to choose desperately, or we start to act in inspiration and continue to choose from peace and love and knowing, which is the intuitive nature of our existence. That's actually our nature, not the thinking we do about the thinking we do that we call human nature, that's greedy and possessive and scarce and fighting all the time and wanting somebody else, jealous, and all those, the seven deadly sins, this sort of divisible idea of hatred and spite and contempt for others, coveting other people's stuff, wanting more of what they had, wishing we hadn't done what we did, we'd be somewhere else, as though we can ever be anywhere else. So this is kind of like going to 7-Eleven and getting a big gulp. You can't tend to drink it typically in one sip. If our anxiety, disturbances, instability, all those sensations are read accurately, it's easy to start to see that we have a bodily form that is functioning extraordinarily well to be giving us information that we are thinking we're not getting, because we're thinking of it as something to run from, because the same sick thinking is being relied on. We're trying to get over it. We're trying to feel better than it, rather than say, wow, like I can almost see it in your face, Mark. I might be thinking a lot of things I don't even think I'm thinking that are having dramatic effects on my experience that I've been trying to escape while I've been recreating them, thinking they were real enough to escape. Creating that drum, thinking of the self dying. Think of this. People feel like their life is threatened when people don't have the same thoughts they do. Human history is littered with wars based on thinking that was different. So we justify killing other people. We must feel there's some great threat to ourself that has the self we tend to talk about as ego, has no basis in anything other than thought, just like lies has no basis in anything other than thought. They're not in the universe. And if they are, they have no basis any more than ours do. So it has no life. It can't even die. Thinking it might die is actually giving it undue credit. We talked about this 2 weeks ago on the walk. Thinking the ego can die gives it credit for living. Once again, we're reinforcing an idea that isn't true because we've developed a narrative that our thinking is in fact the creator of reality, the stories we tell about it. And if we're giving credit to something that is undue, we're probably not giving credit to things that are due. One of those things would be to say, if I'm experiencing this anxiety, I am causing this anxiety in my thinking. If I am experiencing the disabling sensation of not having any value, I'm creating that by having thoughts right now that have no value. They have no substance. They have no denominator, just a numerator acting like they're fractured thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a big oy vey at one point.
I just said it's a lot.
Okay, now let's think about that. Let me suggest my experience. When I started thinking it was a lot, what I realized is I was starting to contemplate beyond the limits of my presumed reality. I was starting to see that my cup runneth over. Literally, I had an 8-ounce cup and I was putting 9 ounces of water in it. And all of a sudden it was not serving its purpose because it couldn't contain it. Well, the thoughts I had have never been able to contain it. They've always been at odds with this. They've always been denying and defying and defending and making believe that numbness that's created means I wasn't doing what I was doing, because I'm trying to desensitize my awareness by going numb to the things I'm doing so I can claim they're not happening. That's just delusion. It's denial being used like psychic anesthesia. If I don't feel it, it's not happening. Well, for sentient beings, not to feel is basically non-existence. We're actually asking to die. We're actually asking not to live. We're actually asking to live in terms that we think fear of death is the problem rather than fear of life in the present is the problem, because I'm unwilling to admit the things I think I am have nothing at all to do with my essence. They're completely concocted and they're based in fear. I can't create something. If reality is reality and it's all I have, and then I go about making believe I'm coming up with reality, I'm taking on the entirety of reality and thinking somehow I'm going to win that fight. That's got to cause fear. And my sense is the whole idea of self is based in fear and hatred and loathing, because we know better than to make believe that it's real when we're perfectly able to imagine it as imagined. Nothing wrong with us imagining things about our experience that have us doing things we're not doing. Nothing wrong with that. When it becomes reality, we think our life depends on implementing it and insisting other people recognize it, or they become assholes because they're not listening to us. They don't see us. They don't know us. Well, the one we think we know has no basis in reality either. That's what we really hate. We're seeing it in other people as though it's them, rather than thanking them and saying, thanks for the perspective you're giving me about what I'm seeing in my own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a major transition. I still, what I realized is that as I got clearer about this, the disturbances that really bothered me became clearer. So sometimes I find myself being petty in ways I never really found myself before because I had dumbed down and neutralized and tried to numb my experience. And I thought, in fact, by not doing those things, I was proving that I was in control, while in fact, those things were still growing in me. I was just putting a bigger and bigger scab over it and constantly having to maintain it in that way. When that anxiety went away in that regard, and it hasn't gone away completely, but when it went away in that regard, I started seeing how petty I was in my thoughts of other people. And I realized that was the pettiness that I had always thought of as being pitiful in my own experience, self-pity and all that. Was my own experience of my own experience that I was really noting, and then trying desperately to give it to someone else so that I could say it's not me. That same way you were just talking about in terms of the awareness. So if we know and feel overwhelmed, something infinite can't be overwhelmed because there's no space. There's no dimension to it. There's no size to it. There's no shape to it. There's none of the shapes, colors, and sizes that we tend to deal with or weight in our physical experience that we're having exist in that realm. And that realm isn't somewhere else. It's here. It's now. It can't be separate. Humans divided the dimensions. They were symmetrically combined and still are, as they've always been. So feeling overwhelmed is feeling thoughts. Our feelings are largely witnessing what we're doing in our own thinking. That's the primary experience we're creating. It isn't elementary, but to our experience, to our human experience, it's primary. Elementary to that is the peace and the knowing and the absolute awareness that we all share, which is why we get so embarrassed promoting these ideas, because we know everybody knows better than we're acting. And we know they know, and we're embarrassed to be potentially found out by them being honest enough to say, that doesn't make any sense. You're acting crazy. You're thinking crazy. We don't want that uncovered. So you've been writing down your thoughts, Martin, right?
Yes.
What happened in that process?
I got honest.
You what?
I got honest.
You had perspective. Yeah. See, when you're in the bubble of thought, you think there's no perspective. You have no perspective because now you're in it. You're not. It's like your eye can't see itself. It can see. We wake up in the morning and don't say, oh, I can't open my eyes. I don't understand how my eye's working. I can't see my eye working, so I can't use it. But with thinking, we do that. I'm in my thought. I think it's real. All of a sudden, I'm in my thought. Thoughts are stuck in my head. I can't get away from them. They keep going. They're attacking me. They're intrusive.
Mm-hmm.
That's why
It's
I
all
love.
induced. What's that?
I said that's why I love sleep.
Well, consider you've been doing a lot of it during the day. So the last step, talking about having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. Spiritual awakening. We're awakened to the spirit and starting to say, oh, it's always here no matter what I think. It doesn't come or go. Anything that is giving me that impression is a thought that isn't true, period. Rather than blame God for not removing my defects, I start seeing that step 6 says when I became entirely ready. When I'm entirely ready, magic seems to happen. Why is it magic? Because I thought that it was some mystical energy against me, some black magic opposing me, when it was in fact the opposition of my own experience I was creating by making believe I could create my own reality. When I became ready, all of a sudden those things started to go away. My readiness made that happen. Not because God ever put them there, God never took them away. If we need to use that excuse in a process of coming to terms with the 12th step, so be it. But God can't give and take unless God's insane and has that insanity to give. This is a self-induced experience. And it's induced by a self that doesn't even exist because the self is induced. It's been crippling. Freud further defined it in the 1800s as real, when in fact it had been a debilitating aspect of humanity's existence since the beginning of self-righteousness and self-indignation being used to kill other people as a result of not thinking like other people, wanting what they have, taking what they have, thinking that force creates dominance rather than force actually reveals weakness. Vulnerability ultimately becomes strength.
Mm-hmm.
Probably always is, but in terms of a transitional awareness from a human level, it becomes obvious that the stability isn't vulnerable at all, that it also has no fight in it. It has no weapons in it. It has no weaponization possible. It's not angry, hostile, cruel, mean. It's loving, it's generous, constantly supportive. But something that's absolute has no threat because it doesn't, nothing that can be done has any effect on it or impact on it whatsoever. It's a very different experience than we think of our human experience when all we think of is that we're human. And people often say that, well, we're only humans. I would challenge that. Certainly we have bodies. Certainly we have human experiences. That if our human experiences is dysfunctioning to the point that understanding becomes misunderstanding and perception becomes misperception and love becomes hate in a sense because we're conditioning who we love based on what they do for us and how they act and behave, rather than despite all those things, seeing that love isn't a divisible thing. And my sense is we don't love, we're made of love. Our source is love. It isn't something I can do, it's something I can express. Just like that absolute reality isn't something I create, it's something I'm a channel for when I'm willing to allow it to pass through that obstructive nature of my thoughts. And really, it's insane for me to think that that obstructive nature of my thoughts ever obstructed anything other than to the opinions I continue to maintain in my thinking about the thinking as being capable of obstruction. That gives it some credit for being real. I'm trying to embolden my wrong thoughts as right by continuing to operate on that basis, thinking that way. So I would say it's eye-opening in the sense that we start seeing that we have an internal awareness, an internal vision that isn't division. Think of that. Vision isn't divisible at that point. It's now a knowing awareness that isn't an eyeball awareness. It isn't this visual account we get from our eyes. It's a knowing awareness. We can see things because understanding is how we see substance within the human experience. And when we're actually understanding, rather than thinking misunderstanding is understanding, because that's the nature of addiction, everything gets reversed, just like a lie is claiming only to be true. The one thing it can't be is the one thing it claims to be. That's a reversal. It's trying to reverse the nature's order and operate on that basis as though that could ever be successful. And it hasn't been for us. We are great creators of solutions that cause long-term problems that we have no idea how to fix, but keep thinking it's far enough down the road, we don't worry about it. And yet we talk about the kids being our future when the future we're leaving them is more and more and more damaged. And at some point, they won't have a future if it continues at that rate. I suspect we will correct because humans seem to get serious right about the time when it's just about impossible to do anything else. Pain is the touchstone of growth because it seems like pain is the final straw that we finally concede that we've known all along, but we've gotten far enough and we can't take it anymore. We've been taking and taking and taking and taking in smaller bites, thinking we can put up with it. But when it gets that's a bottom, when we just decide not to stop digging. We can start growing from there, start walking out of the hole, the pit. Don't have to, we're not required to. But the possibility is absolute because reality is all possibility. Reality offers us everything, including going wrong and thinking it's right. That's ultimately the freedom. If we were restricted in that way, we would be condemned in some way, and love condemns nothing. Nor is it contemptful, spiteful. I mean, the Bible has a good thing on love. Shakespeare wrote a great thing on love is an ever fixed mark. When change it finds, it does not change. And that's a good one for you, Mark, because it's never fixed mark. So if you find change and it doesn't change, you're starting to grasp the concept of an absolute nature. It isn't something that comes or goes, isn't more or less. You know, people say, oh, this guy's very spiritual because he's wearing a Q-tip on his head. You know, or some other impression, a robe or some physical attribute. There's no possibility people can be more or less spiritual. If we're spiritual, we are simply spiritual by nature. That is the nature of our being. That isn't something that we have individually. It's not something we can't share collectively. It's something we absolutely already have and share collectively. So that can be very disturbing to look at it and start seeing the depths that we've gone to make believe who we are is what we think. And the ideas we have about our characteristics and our personalities and all those things are basically all just make-believe. If they are intrinsic to our experience, we don't struggle with them at all. If they are made up, they are a complete struggle from the beginning. Because they only rely on that thinking, just like a lie. A lie does not exist on its own. The attention paid to it is what maintains it. Always. So it can seem preposterous that all of these thoughts could possibly be resolved, but to start to see that it's only one thought we struggle with, and that is that we can be apart from God, which is basically the essence of the Course in Miracles. The contention of the Course in Miracles is that's the original sin and there is no other, and it's continued, we perpetuate it to the degree that we make believe we're creators of reality. Loving nature can't be divisible, can't be diffused, can't be taken or lost, can't be found because it can't be lost. To contemplate what absolute really means is absolute, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipotent. All of those things are completely inclusive of everything, including everything we think isn't even a thing. Way beyond the concept of things into now what we consider to be the subatomic level and things we don't even think exist. We can talk about things we don't even think exist simply by mentioning that if they exist, they exist. We're done. And start to concede it rather than fight over the definition of it and the ideas about it and the philosophies and the theologies and all of that kind of stuff that have pitted humans against humans for long enough to maybe take note. Mark, are you finding greater spans of sitting still and being quiet and noticing things without jumping to the rescue? Including disturbing things?
Jumping to the rescue. You mean since this writing?
Yeah, in the beginning of your recent sort of noticing that you're thinking things you didn't think you were thinking.
I'm willing to let them. Yes. I don't need to defend them as much.
Yeah.
Doesn't keep me as stuck.
Well, and when you say it doesn't keep you as stuck,
Lie.
you're not sticking yourself to it anymore. Right? You know, people say, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. That's the stickiness of those thoughts. It's the story we're telling about them that has us think they're real when they're not real, that we feel stuck by because we stick to the story. It's what you're manufacturing that's causing it. The book says, avoid the deliberate manufacture of misery. Bill knew that this could be done deliberately because he did enough of it to know. So to start seeing that is to start saying, why would I, if I have an absolute peaceful knowing nature that completely unifies me with everything everywhere, I have everything, why in any world, not just the world, would I choose to think I don't? And generally, when that point occurs, people say, I'd have to be crazy. And I say, bingo. Bingo. You just won the lottery. Out of all the trillions of potential thoughts, you just saw clearly what you were doing. It's crazy. And it isn't some genetic defect that can't be overcome if it's being created momentarily by what we're doing right now. And I'm not telling anybody it is. I'm saying, try it on, test it, look at it, start to watch your own experience, start to consider these things. I'm not the end all or the beginning of it at all. I just talk about it. Because I know for my own health, I'm better off when I do. Literally, I'm better off than on all the time, manically, trying to fix it, trying to mend it, trying to prove that I'm right, trying to prove that I have more, trying to prove that I have enough. All of a sudden, I start saying, oh, wow, I really dabble in that thinking quite quickly. But now I'm watching it as something I'm doing rather than thinking of it as something I am. I'm not in it, I'm the seer of it. And that obvious nature is what gurus have talked about since the, Ayurvedic, I forget all the names of the books that go back as long as, thousands of years, have talked about the fact that we are not our thinking. And yet here we are operating on that basis so collectively that it seems preposterous to imagine it could be anything else. And what's preposterous is for us to think it is anything else. Because all it is a thought, imagining itself to be real, being held by a collection of people who have effectively carried that message one to another and continue to, and the reactivity and the stimulation of that reactivity by actually being aggressive and offensive and reactive. When I'm reactive, I'm offensive naturally because people become defensive immediately. So if I'm the cause, I'm the effect in terms of my actions, not me. They're my actions. Thoughts are actions. If we can cause them, we cannot cause them. If we try to treat the effect, we're ignoring the cause. We're thinking of the effect just like we think of reality as something we can turn our back to. We think of the cause as something we've turned our back to by trying to treat the effect and feel better about it. Addiction is doing exactly that, trying to do something, anything, consistently to distract our attention, to give our body a sensation that it likes sufficiently through whatever the chemical processes are that feel better with this immediate self-gratification, this theming self-gratification that we generate in our bodily experience simply by doing those compulsive things. If we're doing that and seeing it as the effect to fix, we're ignoring the cause once again and not seeing the totality of the absolute is reflected in seeing the wholeness of our experience, not the bits and pieces, not just the cause, not just the effect. Cause and effect are connected. Left and right are connected. Up and down are connected. In and out are connected. Good and bad. All those value judgments are connected to the opposite. If I'm thinking positive thoughts, it's because I'm not thinking negative thoughts. And if I think my job is to constantly maintain positive thoughts and think I'm not thinking negative thoughts, I wouldn't have to think positive thoughts if I wasn't thinking negative thoughts. There would be no balance to it. I can think I'm not thinking negative thoughts while I'm thinking negative thoughts because positive and negative work together. Electricity works that way. All of the basic functions in the universe. Why wouldn't we? Only we who think we are separate from reality would imagine that all those basic functional capacities have nothing at all to do with us. And yet they're everywhere and everything. Any thoughts?
I have pensamientos. Oh my gosh. What I want to say is, wow. I like to feed my brain with a knowledge that we have a lot of power to transform our life, that we had a will to decide how to live and to learn from our own experiences and growing. And I believe that, yeah, in the love, that is the most powerful force that we have. And it's infinite, like you said. It is here, it's real. So,
Well,
wow.
and that learning, to that point about the anxiety and the stress and the conflicts and the mental anguish and the emotional turmoil, that's actually the curriculum. Like you're in a college class, you've stepped into the class the first day, every moment is new. So we're constantly standing in the face of new consequences, new effects. If we're looking at that as the curriculum of life, we're learning from it, just like we would when the teacher puts a bunch of formulas on the chalkboard the first day in algebra, and everybody says, what is that? I don't understand that. But with a little bit of interaction with it, you start to say, oh, I see how that works. I see. Now, if I think of everything I have already as everything there is to know, I'm not interested in learning. I'm interested in insisting other people think like I do, because the threat opposed to me has to do with what everyone else isn't thinking like I do. So I spend my whole life trying to get everybody to agree with me, and I become a dictator and a totalitarian authority, and I become a master while I'm actually the slave of all of those characteristics I've taken on. I've created a loop within my own experience that feels very condemned by the exact same things I'm trying to insist everyone else do for me, because they can't possibly undo it while I continue to maintain it.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Crazy. And you know what? I was thinking that anxiety is too to me, it's an emotion, and that emotion push people to run to get a easy solution for the anxiety, because anxiety came with pain, and the pain is from any negative experience. So when we are facing anxiety, sometimes we want to fix that, but we don't understand that running to the any kind of addiction is not a solution. Yeah.
But we think it is.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the blindness, Mark. Back to that sort of idea that we think things we don't think we're thinking, or that we're not thinking things we don't think we're thinking. We've cultivated a blindness within the addictive nature of this thinking that's gone on for centuries, if not thousands of years. And we take for granted human nature just doesn't know things. When in fact, when we first got here, we seemed to know how to survive with absolutely no experience whatsoever. We seemed to know how to eventually figure out how to survive. There seemed to be a knowing awareness in relation to reality, life's terms, in relation to this experience we're having at the most fundamental level, how to operate. We didn't have clothes, we didn't have tailors, we didn't have stores, none of it. We figured it out. There was a sense of knowingness that allowed that to happen, just like every species seems to know what they need to do without the kind of thinking we have. The fact that we can think about our thinking distinguishes us as a species, yet we've used it to actually threaten almost every other species. We're considered the greatest predator on Earth.
We have everything to survive.
Well,
we have everything.
Yeah, we have it all.
Mm-hmm.
We've used it as though we need so much more of it than we actually need, that we've created circumstances that are unsustainable to continue. So we're not going to have certain things. Fish are one of those things. They're just being overfished and overeaten and over, if we were taking what we needed, it would be like trees in a forest. They just take the water they need, and they take the sun they need, and They leave room for everybody else. And yet, even with all that defective nature or defectiveness in our seeming nature, we are still growing as a species, which shows that there must be something beyond the defective nature that's driving us, that organismic survival instinct. When we're thinking these thoughts backward, we're actually threatening our survival and think it's our instinct. And now we're bent on trying to overcome the threat that we're posing in our own experience. And all of the things that would normally save us now are turned against us. To fight is to deny. To fly is to compulse. To freeze is to numb, to deny again. All of those things operate on that same basis. We end up using what are considered instinctive natures in the exact opposite direction to literally cause harm to our current bodily systems and undermine them through the stress and the pressure and the inflammation that occurs and the constriction that occurs. It's interesting that constriction and inflammation are basically the same thing. Within our body. So our bodily systems are undermined by the stress and anxiety in every respect. Now, what's interesting is we say we don't think we know all those things and understand those things. We don't have to understand them at all to completely undermine their capacity. So again, the central issue, the central problem is coming to terms with how we're thinking about things, not the things we're thinking about. The things we're thinking about are much better off left to do what they do without our thinking, when our thinking is so confused and so conflicted that it undermines the ability of those systems to actually operate naturally. They would heal more easily. They would heal naturally. Wouldn't be a struggle. And we think of disease as natural and healing as sort of a miracle. It isn't a miracle, it's natural. Yeah. The miracle is that life has designed life in its own essence, has a design that actually is so abundant in nature that we can continue to pollute it and corrupt it and undermine it in every respect. And it continues to do exactly, doesn't take an attitude, doesn't get pissed. It doesn't say we're leaving. I've had enough. Just continues to grow. Chernobyl's a great example of the ability of nature to come back. Detroit, Mark. I mean, look at the old abandoned buildings. They're being taken over by landscape. They can't afford to maintain it. So the earth is just saying, okay, we'll take you back. You're welcome. It's just disintegrating back into the planet it came from. But in the disintegration of the form on Earth, it's reintegrating with the actual essence of Earth. Just like I would suggest we probably do in this process we call death. And the disintegration of the body is actually the awareness of the being. Now, if that happens in death, why not talk about living life today rather than face the fears of all the death we think exists in the threat of actually letting go of the ideas we have about who we think we are, rather than actually begin to express who we are.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that reversal is actually having us act as though we're afraid of death rather than afraid of living. Because if we were really living, we would have to admit all the defects and start laughing at the imposter that we've been imposing on our experience and others, and be frank about it and say, that wasn't me the whole time. I was actually, I thought I was in a play that started in 3rd grade and I never got off the stage. Mm. So, and Bill talks about phases of development. The big book.
Yes.
So if the absolute nature of the absolute is not in the first, second, and third dimension, it's about, and or the 4th dimension, which is about a point and 2 points, a line, 3-dimensional depth, 4th is time and space. If it's not in that, those dimensions are still of that. That infinite source makes those dimensions possible. We call them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th because those are the ones we identified in that order. But reality didn't identify them at all, nor is that nature of absolute state ever any more or less than what it always is. To begin to concede that as you're thinking about it will begin to clarify the thinking you've been doing as something that's been complicating it the whole time. Because something that doesn't change can't be simpler because it never changes. That's what simple is.
Bill says the program is simple. It's not always easy. He knows he's talking to people that have a tendency of complicating things and think that they're thinking about those things is what they are, rather than realizing they're thinking about those things is they're thinking about those things, rather than the things they're thinking about, and start to introduce themselves to those things as having something to offer more than what they think. Actually have a relationship to what's going on that is full and complete and whole. So the anxiety is an indication something is wrong, and pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth because it is identifying the wrong. And it seems as though we need to do so much wrong before we come to terms with the fact that it's actually wrong. That isn't true. It's just historic and has created a hysterical, dramatic tendency by making believe the longer I put it off, the surer I am to overcome it, rather than the actuality is the surer it is to build charge and build charge and build charge, creating pressure on my physical system and undermining my ability to function at all. My back goes out, my shoulders ache, my head aches, the whole Megillah. And we know it and we're aware of it and we're sensitive to it. And we only act like we're not to maintain the idea that we can desensitize ourselves and numb ourselves, and that not being alive is the goal. Because we're actually asking not to exist by trying to pretend what's happening isn't happening. It's actually an argument in favor of suicide. We have an all-time high in suicide around the world today. Why are people, including single-digit kids? There must be a sense of hopelessness, and I would say it's an accurate sense of hopeless ideas that will never come true. And to continue to maintain them is to have kids look up to the parents and realize something is seriously wrong and have the parents offended. Because the defensive nature of having to even convey that must be reactive thinking, obsessive thinking, that's being perceived by the raw experience of children. They don't have enough mental capacity to not notice those things, but they don't have the mental capacity to always express those things. Yet it does not impair them from being aware of those things and witnessing those things. Oy vey. So what do we do during the week? We've had a conversation.
Action.
Well, keep in mind in that regard, Mark, thinking is an action.
Yes.
We think of only actions, things we witness visibly, because we use those things to prove that's all that's happening. When in fact, the thinking we don't see at all is the primary action, because voluntary action is always dependent on a thought. A voluntary thought, by the way, one we're choosing.
Well, so then let me say contrary action.
If you're thinking contrarily, then that works. But if you're thinking principally and intuitively and act contrarily, that's what we've been doing. We've been fighting the intuition and the knowledge that we have. So we've been told to act contrary because the contrary thinking is going to lead to a contrary action, so we can reverse it. But again, we're treating the effect, right? See how that works? Rather than say, why not clean up the contrary thinking? We're talking about not acting on the contrary thinking, so we're reinforcing the fact that there's nothing we can do about the thinking. We don't see it as an action, we don't think of thinking as an action, and it's a primary action because it happens, it occurs, and it's a choice. What we think about and how we think is a choice. That we think is not a choice. It's natural for a body to think. Even bodies in comas continue to think, they continue to process, they continue to run the body. And people have woken up after 20 years of being in a coma, and all of a sudden their body says, okay, let's get back to it. Some evidence that that thing is processing, even when we think of them completely detached from reality and out of it, per se. So to start to think of thinking as a primary action, we'll be starting to see that the effects you're creating are actually coming from that freedom we have to choose. And if we're so free to choose that we can choose things that are wrong and think that they're right, it starts to become pretty obvious that we've been the creator of this whole
manic episode, obsessive episode the whole time. We're not the creators of reality. We're creators of an effect that is manifest misery and pain and suffering and doubt and insecurity and instability. Within all the capacity we have to express a loving, generous, whole, intuitive, knowing nature, we've chosen to make believe all we know is what we think. And that's a major glitch in the system. No computer does well when it gets bad information in the basis of its processing. The processor is screwed up. It's going to be screwed up in everything we ask it to do. It's exactly what we were doing. When you were talking about your thinking lenses, nourishing food for thought is the same as food for our bodies. If the food is bankrupt, which most food is today, and the stores, I listened to some show on food in the stores, that 70% of it doesn't even qualify under the term food because it's so processed that it doesn't have the elements that would cause it to be even referred to as food in terms of definition. Doesn't mean it's not edible. You can eat, electric cords if you want.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean it's healthy.
Exactly.
With the thinking. When I entertain a thought, the major transition, it's not the wrong thought I'm entertaining, it's the thought that it's true that sets me on the collision course and also identifies my thought as being the culprit in that experience I'm creating. So I can have all the wrong thoughts I want. None of them being wrong are going to have any applicable purpose. So I can try them and say, okay, well, that doesn't work, and stop. But as soon as I think it's right, I'm going to keep trying it, keep trying it, and keep trying it, keep trying it, and keep trying it, thinking someday it will be true because I'm trying to prove that I am the creator of reality.
Exactly.
That is called insanity.
Exactly.
It's self-induced, self-imposed, as the book says, by a self that is only thought to exist because we presume that thinking of itself, which is our contemplative advantage to imagine and to consider things that are inspired and whole and complete and phenomenal and never been realized in terms of a transformative experience, we've all of a sudden turned that against our whole experience by making believe we're the creators of truth and reality. So what do we have to express? Debilitated effects, defective effects, defective, not effective. They're not efficient. They're not going to work. They're not going to function. They're going to dysfunction. Sitting with this, in my experience, and I've said this many times, I had a panic attack when this actually hit me because my whole body felt the charge of all the fear I'd been storing my whole life. And it was the nausea, the tension in my neck. My neck is complete. I was at a point where I could barely turn my neck, and it's just naturally been relieved. I don't know that I have enough time on this planet or enough chances or enough willingness to allow that healing to be bigger, but I'm happy for whatever happens. And I suspect that what we do pass on to others historically as descendants is whatever enlightenment we're able to actually bring to the table and share in ways that other people begin to operate on the basis of. And if something through history has actually worked, at first it seems that presenting it is completely objectionable and puts fear into the people who have been promoting the idea as being reality, to the point that those people want to kill people who suggest that things are not the way they've been thought of. Copernicus is a great example. And then all of a sudden, within a short period of time, and I mean short, it might be 50 or 100 years by human state, everybody's thinking, boom, why? Because it works. If you apply something that works, it works. You don't need to think about it anymore. You just apply it in the future. If you stir a cup with sugar in it, it's going to dissolve if the water's hot. You learn that. You don't have to think, how did I do that? What is a spoon? Where do I get the sugar? You know by experience. That's a human form of knowing. But the thinking about things unreal, lies, never work. And to think that someday they will work is to see the insanity of making believe that we are the creators of reality. We are products of reality. Thinking is a product of a human body. It's a miraculous, we think of it as complex, but it's not complex at all. There's 8.5 billion of them right now. It's not complex enough to be completely complicated. It seems to happen when people have sex, it just works. It happens. We produce these bodies. They're magnificent in terms of their potential. We're not using them in a magnificent way. I suspect we're on a verge of doing that, though. I suspect that all the craziness in the world that's becoming more obvious to people as being crazy, because people are talking about it that way, may be a signal sufficient to collect. I think COVID gave everybody a chance to see a problem simultaneously worldwide. It changed the dynamic of society dramatically. And my sense is there's a much greater awareness that we're all part of something that has existed before. And we also have the digital collective computer internet means to communicate it and talk about it and start to share it. So activity is not always productive in a useful sense. It's often productive in a non-useful sense. And the book talks about becoming usefully whole. What does that mean? The product is beneficial, not just to me, to everyone. If I can do something right and nobody else is doing it, everyone else will be doing that very, very quickly. It's like terms in language. Terms are coined by somebody somewhere in a book or in a talk or something, and all of a sudden people use that term because it fits. People got what it meant, and they use it quickly. It becomes contagious very fast. That same contagion in a reactive sense is debilitating and deforming and disabling in terms of our capacity, our functional capacity. While the other awareness is all about function, all about productivity, all about abundance. There is no scarcity in it. There's no city of scare, of fear. It's an absolute knowing nature that is allowing everything to happen that's happening right now. And that includes everything that's happening everywhere anything's happening, and everything that may be beyond what we can even imagine is happening. As big as we can think, there's probably more than that in great exponential ways beyond it. And that's just within the physical realm, to think of it in terms of big. When you're thinking of the infinite, it's absolutely not involved in space and time and shape and size and breadth and width and height, and none of that. That becomes something that is just a present state of being, of knowing awareness, and it can't not know because it doesn't think. All right, so the week. Stepping away from this, as you said, you get overwhelmed, Mark. So do I. In my experience, beginning to sit and just take a breath and witness what's happening, a lot of that anxiety starts to literally dissolve, not resolve, because I'm not fixing it. It's not me doing it. It's me allowing it. And it starts to dissipate naturally, just like water evaporates and fog dissolves when the sun hits it. So the enlightenment of the thinking actually dissipates the pain and the trauma. My sense is there is no trauma other than where we sit and what we're doing in the present. There may be a collective charge in our body that's been held so long because we've consistently tried to defend and fight while maintaining it. So the pressure has built. But the fact is, the reality has never changed. What's changed is the deformation of our body. The disinformation has been deforming our own experience physically. But that charge, as it's allowed to be seen and breathe through, just say, wow, this is very uncomfortable. Take a deep breath and just let it be. It isn't a fight. The fight's over if you want to begin to diffuse it and dilute it and have it dissolve. There is no fight in it. The fight has been maintaining it. There's no obligation to maintain it any further. There's no obligation to manage it. There's no obligation to fix it. And you'll see that it will just start to disperse and disintegrate. Literally, think of that, disintegration. The awareness we have of it being something just basically evaporates into the nothingness that we created the fantasy out of to begin with. We've been living a dream as though it's a nightmare, and in nightmares, it tends to be very scary until we wake up and say, oh, it was only a dream. As soon as we do that, we're relieved of that fear. We may still have an experience of it. We may witness it. We may realize we have the potential of that fear, but the essence of that fear is gone.
And it's the exact same thing we're doing here in a contemplative, meditative awareness as we go through our day. Not only when we take 20 minutes to feel better, so we can then face the challenges and continue to repeat and reinforce the ideas that create the conflicts that give us the impression we need to meditate to get relief again, or we need to do something to get relief. And I'm not suggesting not to do any of those things, but that those things are emblematic of trying to fix something that we are also committed to maintaining if we're constantly having to redo some ritual to feel better about it. If we're already better, if we're already fine, if we're already good, if we're already whole, if we're already complete, it might be worth thinking in those terms as a basis for the daily affirmation. That Bill doesn't say, by the way, Mark, take action. He says take affirmative action. That means principled action. Those aren't contrary actions. Spiritually principled actions aren't contrary because they're based in truth and reality and love and honesty and all of the principles that come out of the hope and faith and courage. But now we're having hope in something that's hopeful. So how much do we need of that? Not much, because it's hopeful. It's already hopeful. It's something realized immediately when we rely on it. We can have faith on it and all of a sudden have our faith confirmed. We don't need more faith. We're aware of it. We're confirmed in our own experience. Those are those moments of clarity. Those what do they call it? Well, it's an awareness of awareness, effectively. Moment of clarity is a good example, because clearly, if something's clear in a moment, it isn't a lie. And if it's a lie and it's clear, immediately the lie is undone too, because it's being seen for what it is. If a lie is a lie, it's true. If a lie is thought to be true, it's not true. That's the whole basis of a lie. Lie is something that only survives on the basis of thinking it's exactly the opposite of what it actually is. And in truth can't be an opposite, because there is no dimension. So the opposite of the truth would be true. And the opposite of, and half of it would be the whole, and any part of it would be all those things disappear in terms of the way we think of things relatively. It's not to say we shouldn't have, wouldn't have, can't have, won't have the human experience. It's to start to see that if we function on the basis of absolute knowing, our ability to function as a human exponentially increases, because we're now aligned with the absolute power of this universe, the absolute power, whatever that power is, if it's power at all, whatever the essence of it is our source. All of us together, simultaneously.
I just wanted to Google the definition of affirmative.
What does it say?
Agreeing with a consent to statement or request, affirmative answer. I guess a noun would be a statement or agreement with a consent to assertion or request.
It's to affirm something, effectively. It's sort of like...
Again, I know what I think it means.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about affirmations, people do affirmations. They repeat thoughts. Well, if you're affirming something that already exists, you're basically aligning thinking with what exists. So that would certainly be an affirmation of thought, because it would be affirming a principle. And that's what Bill talked about, is affirming principles and affirming actions, because he's talking about spiritual principles. He's not talking about evil principles, which is if you keep working hard. What's interesting about the absolute, which is kind of ironic, is that people can absolutely believe there's no God and not notice that they're absolutely believing something. So somehow or another, the absolute, when you start looking at things in total, it keeps appearing. If everything's always happening, that's always happening, always, wherever we are. There are things you can begin to think of to reaffirm the nature of your existence, rather than the thinking we do about whether it should be happening, what we wish was happening, what we thought might happen, what we wanted to have. All that stuff is just, it actually causes doubt, because it's based in doubt, based in questions rather than of affirmation of things happening. So those are things you can do during the week. Also, as you witness your witness, you'll start noticing things changing that you don't even think have changed. And it's kind of like hindsight, where you say, wow, I don't do that thing I used to do. I didn't react that way at all. I had a much different experience.
you'll start noticing that nature is so natural, you don't notice it like you do the pain and the struggle and the suffering and the conflicts. So it begins to obviously delineate this experience we're creating that's wrong versus the experience we're having that's right. And I would suggest the difference between wrong and right is that right always works and wrong never does. What wrong does is work to undermine and destroy, which I would say would be an evil principle, because it's the idea of destroying something that would otherwise be perfectly healthy, when in fact we're designed to disintegrate anyhow at some point. We don't have to rush the process. And it would seem to me if we're trying to rush the process, we're trying to eliminate our potential to complement that process and to add to that process because we haven't been doing anything that's meaningful enough to actually give us any of the reassurance that would actually confirm the affirmative thinking that we're doing, because we haven't been thinking affirmatively, we've been thinking contrarily. So we want to bow out instead of have the presence of mind to say, it's only what I'm thinking that's causing this, nothing more. There's no evil source that is doing this to me. And like we talked about last week, evil spelled backward is live, live. So if our thinking is backward, we're acting in evil ways, trying to destroy things that would otherwise be healthy. And that would certainly be contrary to survival, the instinct to survive and thrive. And that would be contrary to our instincts. And Bill talks about our instincts going awry. That self-centered mania, out of control, riot, run amok. So as you're noticing, take a breath as the height of those feelings occur that would generally get you thinking about them more. Just take a breath and see if it doesn't sort of, breathing is a natural sedative. And breath in Latin is spirit. So for the human experience, breathing, because it's something we're all always doing, is somewhat emblematic of an absolute source. We're always doing it. We don't have to wonder, and like the gravity, we don't have to understand it to utilize it. It's interesting that we think we need to understand our thinking in very complex terms and our history and all that stuff before we can finally come to terms with it, when in fact the terms of it are only happening in the present. Love you guys. I appreciate that you come and we get to talk about it.
Yeah, appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I'll see you during the week.
Yes.
As well.
Yes,
Lenses,
Jack. Yes.
good to see you. Say hi to Esther.
Yes, I'm very happy seeing you, and I see you soon. Do you want me
Thank you.
to be here next time?
Yeah, I'm going to leave that to you. I like people's
Okay.
own volition to decide, because I think they're better
Aw.
participants. So I want you to do that.
Yes.
And you're always welcome, as you know today. So
Thank you, Jack. I love this meeting, so I appreciate this. I appreciate
you.
you and everyone. It's beautiful. You know what, Jack? It's beautiful. I just love it because I want love, and I believe love, and I want to be always welcome.
Peace, my child. See
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye. I see you. Hugs.
Thanks everyone
Bye.
for listening.
Bye.